I teach Iyengar yoga, and so some of the style you're going to see through this class is that I'm going to start by demonstrating the pose or demonstrating the practice, and then we'll end up doing it together. So you'll get a chance to watch the screen and you'll get a chance to kind of see what you're about to get into, and then we'll do it and we'll have that time to practice. So I hope that that makes it a little bit easier when we kind of are moving from, maybe 2 or 3 poses, or we're laying on the ground for these first few poses, for an example. I hope that that demonstration time maybe takes a little bit of the question out of it so you don't have to constantly look at the screen. And I do also prioritize repeating myself and going through more detail verbally so that hopefully you can just hear me and maybe take some auditory cues as you go through the poses with me. If you do have any concerns that come up, specifically any sharp pain that you feel, that's most likely a sign to stop and back off. If you feel any sort of achy or stretching sensations, usually those are okay. Those are generally encouraged in yoga, and especially once you start getting into some hip work, which it can be quite deep at times. But do be aware and respectful of your body and your body's boundaries. If something is too much, try and gauge maybe backing off and not going in as deep. I will give you some tips on form, which is something that we definitely want to prioritize. Overall, my intention is to address 3 key aspects in a yoga practice: flexibility, which is very commonly associated with yoga. The second is strength. We really want our joints to be strong and support us through these poses. But the third one is mobility. How do we integrate that movement in our joints next to strength and flexibility? So that's my personal goal here through this class is to integrate those 3 aspects through our poses. I'm going to switch the screen over here. Let me see if I can do a screen share. So this is a super cool website. It's called Sketchfab, but they have these 3D models of all kinds of stuff. And I love using it for the anatomy. Oop, that's a little too close. But this is the back of your pelvis. Your pelvis is that, essentially what we summarize as our hips. But if you were to take your hands and put them at the base of your waist, you can feel your hip bones. And your hip bones are these top iliac crests that you're kind of seeing in this picture where my mouse is moving around. And so as you feel where those hip bones are, you might be able to start kind of associating where these other spinal aspects connect. And so, I wish this wouldn't do that so much. So we have our pelvis, and then right in between the, hips, the iliac crests, we have our sacrum. And it's kind of this triangular shaped bone that really connects our pelvis to our spine. So this is a back view. Now, if we were to look here at the side, you can see these are your sit bones. So if you're sitting on the floor, you might feel that sharpness kind of underneath your hips. Those are usually your sit bones. Or if you've had a small kid sit on your knee and they have those sharp, sit bones digging into your thigh, that's most likely what you're feeling, is that base of the pelvis. Now, here is where our hip is attached to our thigh. So we have our femur bone, which is this long bone hanging down here. And this is a ball and socket joint. And so there's quite a significant range of motion within this joint area, which we're going to experience a little bit of today. So that's what's going on from a bone and kind of structural standpoint. This angle is kind of as if you were standing next to someone or standing next to a skeleton and looking down and into their pelvis. You can see that crest of the pelvis, sacrum's back there, and it's all connecting to the spine. Down at the bottom, I'll turn around just slightly here. You can see this is where your tailbone is. And so kind of at the top of the buttocks, right where the buttocks start to divide, that's where your sit bone is. And that's something that I will be referencing. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, if you look on this other side of this pelvis, you see a little bit more of the muscular structure and what muscles are holding all of these bones and joints together here. I'm going to turn around to the back side here, since we started on the back with the skeleton view. And so here you have that gluteus maximus, that larger buttocks muscle, super strong muscle. And sometimes if it's contracted quite a bit, you can feel that affect the hips or even affect the spine. The main muscle that I wanted to kind of point out to you guys today is this one right here. It's connected to the femur bone, the head of the femur bone here on the other side of the pelvis, but it weaves up. And as you can see, it's connected to the vertebrae here in the spine. And so this is where sometimes if we have something going on in our hips, or maybe a lack of mobility or a stagnation, maybe we're not moving the hips a lot, some people complain about back pain. And this is often the culprit of that experience, is this iliopsoas muscle. So it's connected to our spine, but it's also connected to our hips. And so they're very much so intertwined. We're going to do a couple of poses today that really address that muscle in particular. And hopefully you can maybe identify if it's something that might be aggravating or adding some extra tension for you in your body. But otherwise, there's, I mean, just all kinds of muscles. And so it's a pretty incredible structure that we have, and pretty incredible bodies that we get to live in. But I just wanted to show you this visually and kind of put some name to some of these aspects of our pelvis. We're not going to do a full-on anatomy class today. I really just wanted to give you some food for thought so you can kind of see the structure of it, since I'll reference a couple of things that you're looking at. If you have any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself. But I'm going to go ahead and move on from this now, and we're going to get started. So that was a fun 3D view of the pelvis, and I'll add that in an email to everybody once we're all finished with the class today. Now, when you registered, you most likely noticed that I had mentioned you're probably going to want some blocks or a chair, some blankets, and a strap. If you have some wall space around you somewhere, that is phenomenal. I'm going to show some variations so that if you don't have some of these props, you'll know what to do. But these are great options to have around near you. If you don't have any blankets, then I highly recommend maybe grabbing a stack of towels or something that you can, kind of substitute in bed blankets or sheets, or if you have any pillows on your sofa, things like that. But the support's definitely going to be necessary. So I just wanted to plug that in. We're not going to try and get away with no props today. So if you need some help with substitutions, then I'd recommend grabbing those now. So you are welcome to set yourself up however you feel comfortable in relation to the camera, but I do want to show you where we're headed before we get started today. We're going to practice a couple of poses while lying down with our hips facing the wall. So I'm going to demonstrate that now. You can just go ahead and watch for a moment, and then we'll move on and do it together. So I'm going to start by scooting myself up close to the wall here, and I'm laying on my side. Now, when I turn, I'm trying to keep my spine and my pelvis moving as one unit. So I'm not necessarily just like flopping into it. I really don't want to do any sort of major twisting of the spine. So knees tuck in, you can use your hand to press down, and I'm rolling on my back as my back of my pelvis comes to the floor. And we're going to straighten the legs, and we're going to rest here for a few breaths. Having a blanket nearby underneath the head will also be helpful, especially if you notice your chin is jetting up towards the ceiling. I'll give you some more points once we're in the pose, but since I'm just demonstrating, I'm going to move pretty quickly into what we're going to practice next. The next thing is that the feet are going to go flat on the wall. We're going to take a few deep breaths, really trying to lengthen the spine towards the wall while our knees are bent and our hips are quite deep here at the front of the hip socket. From here, you might find that you can easily grab onto the outer edges of the feet for a pose called Ananda Balasana. This is blissful child pose. If you start to feel that your hips are really tight, or maybe the low back is aching in this position, we'll throw a strap around the feet, and you can just kind of extend the pose so you're not so close, or you're welcome to even hold on to the shins. The main aspect that we want to keep in mind is that the heel is in line with the knee. We don't have the feet dropping towards the hips. Instead, we want to keep the heels a little bit high so the bottoms of the feet are facing the ceiling. Then if you have the space in the room, we'll straighten the legs. We'll come back, we'll do that a couple of times. From there, we'll bring our feet back to the wall, can straighten the legs, and we're gonna practice a pose called Supta Kapotanasana. So this is a reclined pigeon pose. What I'm doing is I'm bending one of my legs, I'm externally rotating, so I'm turning that femur bone outward as I bend the leg and resting my ankle on my opposite thigh. We'll be here for a few breaths and then we'll switch sides. The second time that we practice this pose, you're welcome to bend that knee, which is going to make it a little bit more intense. So you don't have to, but it's absolutely an option, and it's something that I'll bring up while we're in the pose. Then we'll straighten the legs. We'll get ready to move on into some other poses. Coming out by reaching one arm up and overhead, rolling over to the side, and then you can turn towards the floor and push yourself up. So that's where we're headed. Why don't you go ahead and have a strap, maybe a blanket or two nearby, just in case. We're not wanting to, you know, it's, rather than saying that, I should say it's awesome to have extra support, right? We do want to integrate some sense of ease in our yoga practice. There are days when we want to challenge ourselves a little bit more than others, but this first pose, we really do want to have some nice support so that it's attainable and comfortable, and we give ourselves a chance to tune into our body and really what our body needs. Often in yoga, it's very easy to think about what we want to attain or accomplish, and we get into that mentality of just pushing through a lot of things, and we really want to start to tune in and figure out, what does the body need rather than our minds? What does the body need to help it and support it? So with a blanket and a strap nearby, you'll start laying down on your side if you haven't already gotten up yet, and then you can roll onto your back. We do want the hips to be about a fist's distance away from the wall. They don't have to be right up against the wall, but at least having a fist's distance is quite nice. If your hips are a little bit farther away, that's absolutely fine as well. So we're just starting with legs up the wall. You're welcome to grab a blanket, place it underneath your head, just resting the hands on the floor. You take a smooth, steady inhale and a smooth, steady exhale. Start to feel your body settling down into the floor. With every exhale, notice how your spine can feel a little more restful with the support of the floor. You're welcome to keep your eyes open through this practice, or if it's more comfortable for you, you're welcome to close the eyes as well. As we take a few breaths here, you might even notice your hips starting to settle and weigh towards the floor. During your next inhale and exhale, gently try to lengthen the breath. So breathing a little bit deeper, extending your inhale and exhale to be a little bit longer. Let go of any tension in your eyes, lips, or jaw. So as we first come into this pose, we're really just allowing the spine to rest. There's no in-depth activity at this point in time. As we start to move forward, want you to think about using your breath to actually lengthen the spine. And so, what I mean by that is when you inhale, try to lift the chest away from your hips. We still want the hips to feel as though they're weighing heavy on the floor. But with that inhale, see if you can really feed that lift of the chest and even that length through the very top of your head. So the spine and the neck even starts to lengthen. And through every cycle of breath, see if you can maintain that length. You're welcome to place your hands on your abdomen, just feeling your inhale and exhale. Now, keeping your hands on your abdomen, go ahead and bend your knees so the feet are still flat on the wall. Knees are bent slightly. And you're going to use your hands to feel where your thigh bone is connected to your pelvis. It's really that hip crease that's on the front of the hip. You'll be able to feel where that thigh bone, the femur bone, is moving into the hip socket. And since this area is bent right now, it's a little bit more noticeable. In Iyengar yoga, they call this area the pit of the thigh. So just like you have an armpit, we now have a pit of our thigh to consider. With every inhale and exhale, still try to lengthen the spine. And now you can use your hands to actually press into that pit of the thigh. As your hands press into that crease, pushing the hips towards the wall, use your breath to lengthen the chest away from that area. Now, at this time, you might start to notice that there are different habits in each hip. Maybe one hip is a little tighter internally, or maybe you can even feel with your hands and your fingers that one of your hips has a little more tension. As you take a smooth, steady inhale and exhale, try to release that tension, allowing those hips to settle into the floor. Now, with your hands in this position, I want you to think of a hula dancer. And as you kind of sway your hips side to side, just like a hula dancer would, notice how your side waist is also affected. And so when you're doing this hula motion, whichever hip is farther away from you has a little bit of a longer side waist to it. And so just start to notice that, how that shift in the pelvis, that shift in the hips is really starting to affect our torso. And this is pretty significant, especially if you have noticeable tension in one hip more than the other. If one of your hips is quite tense and generally has a habit of lifting towards the side waist, you might end up walking around or you might end up, operating through your life with a little bit more tension on one side of your spine than the other. So noticing as you do that hula motion, how the side waists are lengthening, and also how the spine is now moving. And you can come back to a neutral position. So side waists are evenly long. And we're going to move into that Ananda Balasana pose, that blissful child pose. So you're welcome to grab your strap if you'd like and place it over your feet, or you can just grab onto your ankles. And if your hips feel deep enough or mobile enough at this time, you can even bring your knees towards the floor a little bit more and hold on to the outsides of the feet. I have my arm along my inner knee, and then it crosses the front of the ankle and holds on to the outside of the foot. So overall, the knees are moving along the outside of the side waist. So you take a nice deep inhale, deep exhale. Think about that pit of the thigh that you just had your hand on. Now, we don't necessarily have our hands there to help encourage some depth or to physically deepen it by touch. But as you almost stretch your tailbone towards the wall, and you take a nice deep inhale, lifting the chest away, lengthening the spine. See if you can deepen that hip crease. If your tailbone is lifting up towards the ceiling, you might feel some hardness in your low back. You might feel as though your low back or the back of your pelvis is kind of jamming into the floor. And if that's a sensation that you feel, you can always back off the depth, meaning you can shift your hands towards your ankles instead. This is going to give you the space to really prioritize deepening that hip crease so that the spine is nice and flat on the floor. Just taking a few more breaths here. Now is a great time to start thinking about your tailbone, that base of the spine. Naturally, the tailbone kind of curves forward, but see if you can almost lengthen your tailbone towards the floor. So there's a little bit of a different sharpness that comes to the hips when we start taking that very base of the spine, not just to the wall that our hips are near, but really try and stretch that tailbone down to the floor. We're going to start straightening our legs. So we're still laying on our back, we're still deepening the hips. And as you straighten your legs off to the side, take a nice deep inhale and exhale. Really try to make them stick straight. Again, if you need to use your strap or hold on to the ankles, please, I invite you to do that. What we want to prioritize here is really getting that depth in the hips and that length in the spine. So rather than feeling any hardness of the low back pressing into the floor, notice how that reach of the tailbone towards the floor kind of lifts the low spine off the floor, almost lifts that sacrum off the floor. Now, this does require some deep mobility in the hips. So if you're feeling some resistance in accomplishing that, it's most likely what's going on, that the hips are just learning how to access this mobility. And you can bend your knees back into that blissful child's pose. Just one more time, we're going to straighten the legs off to the side, trying to make the legs stick straight here. You reach your tailbone towards the floor and lift the chest up. Soften any tension in the eyes, lips, or jaw. Notice if there's any tension in the forehead that can be let go of. And then you can slowly bend your knees, bring your feet back to the wall, and we'll straighten the legs. Well, if your hips are tight, that pose alone can be quite a bit. Can be a lot of mobility getting inspired through that one. So taking a moment to just rest with the legs up the wall, really help that circulation in the hips, even helps the heart, since the heart doesn't have to work to pump that blood from the feet back up the body. You also have your spine and pelvis in a nice neutral position in this one. This is definitely one of those poses that can easily be integrated into everyday life. Now we're going to move into that reclined pigeon pose, Supta Konasana. So you can just start with the legs straight, and we're going to start with our right leg. And so you'll bend your right leg and take your right ankle to the left thigh. Now we want that ankle to be placed above the knee. So we're not putting any pressure on the knee joint. Now, you're not going to use your hands for this. Sometimes I see people, pushing on their knee and pushing on their legs. Well, we're not going to do that today. Instead, what I want you to think about is actually pressing your right ankle into that thigh. Now, as you press your ankle into that thigh, try and stretch your bent knee towards the wall. So we're really using some engagement, muscular engagement to access this mobility. There is a slight flexion in your feet. So we're not just allowing the feet to be completely limp here. Instead, try and lift your toes towards your shin. Notice how that whole bottom of the foot starts to stretch. There's a contraction in the top of the foot and the front of the ankle. Now, this will stabilize your ankle here. If you start to feel any tension in your knee, you can go ahead and either come out of the pose completely or try not to press it towards the wall so much. So we stabilize that ankle, pressing the ankle into the thigh. And as you try and stretch your knee towards the wall, notice how that whole thigh bone has to turn outward now. This is a external rotation of that femur bone. So you can go ahead and I want you to take one of your hands, specifically your right hand, and as you grab onto the bottom of your thigh of that bent knee, I want you to try and turn and pull it, not only towards yourself, but out to the sidewall. And so you're feeding that external rotation. You're also giving a little bit of a physical imprint. So as you do this with your hands, you're reminding your thigh what direction it's meant to move. So that external rotation has that inner thigh lifting up and out to the side. Now you're welcome to stay in this position here, or if you want to kind of push that mobility, deepen that mobility, you can start to bend your left knee. And as you bring that left foot flat to the wall, so that's that straight leg, as you start to bend that knee and bring that foot flat to the wall, you're going to notice that that whole right shin gets closer to you. But now that external rotation in the hip has to be even deeper. So we're still pressing that right ankle on the opposite thigh and actively trying to lift that right knee away from us. This pose is helping with that lovely iliopsoas muscle. Just a few more breaths here. Smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale, softening the face and the eyes. And then you'll start to straighten that left leg and bring your right knee back to center and straighten the right leg. So sometimes people might experience some numbing or tingling. And if you feel that, please feel free to come out of the pose a little bit sooner that I might give direction to. We don't necessarily want to push ourselves through the pose when we're feeling that tingling or, numbing sensation as if something is falling asleep. Usually there's some sort of lack of blood flow going on or, nerve entrapment. And we really don't want to hold the pose for long if we're feeling something like that. Now we're going to switch to the other side. So you can slowly bend your left leg, placing your left ankle on that thigh, opposite leg. Still keeping the feet flexed, especially that bent knee. And with that foot flexed, try and press your ankle into the opposite thigh and stretch your bent knee away from you. We're not using our hands, but instead really trying to use all those small muscles in the hip and the leg to help accomplish this external rotation in the thigh, in the hip socket. Now, before we were using our hand on our thigh and integrating a little bit of touch to get that external rotation of the thigh. Now what I want you to do is take your hand, and as you spread your thumb and your pointer finger, you kind of create this L on your hand. And it also kind of looks like a check mark. We're going to take that check mark and I want you to place it in the pit of your thigh. So, really, where that hip crease is. And as you press into that, really try and give more of that external rotation sensation. And so you're using your hand, giving a little bit of pressure, and then sliding your hand from the inside of that hip crease out to the outer hip. And so here's that external rotation that we want to be happening deep in the femur bone rather than the knee. So as we sometimes these things can be quite gray. Sometimes our body can feel quite gray in our mind. And so integrating these touch points can really help connect our body and our brain a little bit more so we can tune into these areas we might not have a lot of sensation in. Now you're welcome to stay here with your right leg straight, or if you feel comfortable doing so, you can start to bring that right foot flat to the floor, bending that right knee. It's going to make this pose a little bit more intensified, requires a little bit more mobility here. And as you take a few breaths, pressing that left ankle into the thigh and really trying to stretch that left knee away from you, that bent knee. You take a smooth, steady inhale and exhale, lift the chest up, soften the face, soften the eyes. And then you can straighten your right leg, bringing your left knee back to center and straightening it up the wall. Now we're back at that starting pose of legs up the wall. Just taking a few breaths here. You can soften the hips, soften the legs. Just take a moment to let go. Let go of everything, everywhere in the body. Now to come out, you're gonna bend your knees. You can reach your arm, specifically maybe the right arm up and overhead, roll to your right side, and come up to sit. So we're gonna sit now in a pose called Baddha Konasana. This is bound angle pose. You're welcome to have your strap nearby as well, because we're gonna use that for the next pose that we move into. Now you definitely wanna sit on some support for this pose. Bound angle pose is a seated posture, and we have the feet together with the knees wide, but we want to make sure that we're sitting on enough support so that it's not aggravating the hips and that we can maintain some lift in the low back. So I'm going to demonstrate really quickly. If you know this pose, you're familiar with it, you're welcome to go ahead and move into it. But I want to point out and show some of the posture aspects and what the difference is with some support underneath our hips versus without. So I'm going to turn sideways just so you can see. And in this pose, the feet slide in together and the knees go wide. Now here I don't have any support under my hips. And generally what tends to happen is that the low back might want to round. And as the hips might be a little bit tight, the low back rounds, and it doesn't feel as easy to sit upright and get that nice lifting posture in the spine. Or if we do, it takes a lot more effort. So once we start to add some support here underneath the hips, it lowers our center of gravity and really helps us get that lift of the low back and that lift of the sacrum up, as opposed to just allowing it to drop back to the wall behind us. So this is where that can be very, very helpful to have some seated or support under our hips while in seated postures. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn to the other side now and add another blanket. And if you're not in this pose already, then we can go ahead and come into it together. So we'll start with the feet flat on the floor, sitting nice and tall on our blankets. And here you can use we're gonna start by bending the left knee. So you can grab behind your knee, kind of near the thigh here, and then you're going to use your opposite hand to hook underneath the ankle. Now here we can integrate that feeling of that external rotation. So that inner thigh moving and turning outward. And then I'm gonna bring my heel as close as I can to my pelvis with the foot flexed slightly. Now I'm gonna do the same to the other side, hooking underneath the knee near the thigh with the same arm as the side you're working with, same leg you're working with. And then I'm gonna hook underneath the ankle. Again, external rotation here as I bring my heels together, feet together, knees wide. This is another pose that might be an opportunity for the knee to feel a little bit aggravated. So coming in that way that I demonstrated is really gonna help create some space in the knee, but it also makes sure that that external rotation is happening in the hip instead. That's really where we want the turning, not so much the knee, not so much the ankle. Now from here, you're welcome to hold on to the ankles and sit up nice and tall, taking a nice deep inhale and exhale. When we were laying on the floor, it was a little easier to feel the spine. We kind of felt our weight of the spine laying on the floor, and we were able to tune into that. So now see if you can have that same visual in your mind right now. See if you can feel where the back of your pelvis is. See if you can feel where the back of your rib cage is. And as you take a nice deep inhale and exhale, lift your chest away from the pit of those thighs. So we're familiar with these areas from laying down on the floor in the past poses that we were in. Now we're just in a couple of different positions, right? The legs are a little bit wider. Now we have a different relationship to gravity since we're sitting up rather than laying down. So notice if it's more difficult or if you can still tune into these areas of your body. So feeling that pit of the thigh, nice and deep, that external rotation of the femur bone, which is the thigh bone, while also feeling that lift of the side waist, that lift of the chest. And see if you can even lengthen and lift through the very top of your head so the whole spine and the neck even feels a little bit more long. Again, this pose is Baddha Konasana, bound angle pose. Now you can just watch here for a moment and I'll show you where we're headed next. We're gonna practice a pose called expanded angle pose or Upavista Konasana. We're gonna bring our knees together. And again, I'm just demonstrating to start. So if you're familiar, you're welcome to come in. But if you're not, then go ahead and take a moment just to watch. Knees come in, and then we'll extend the legs nice and wide. I like to use the edge of my mat to know that my heels are even with each other, because what I do with my feet is definitely going to affect my hips. You might also notice if one leg maybe is a little tighter, maybe it doesn't want to go as wide. So making sure that there's some symmetry in there and really supporting that leg or that side that might be a little bit more tense. So we'll be here in Upavista Konasana. From this, we're gonna practice a seated twist, and this is where your strap is gonna be helpful. It's not necessary if you don't have one that's long enough. So you could sit and we'll just twist towards our straight legs while sitting upright. But if you do have a strap, you can take your strap, lace it around the toe ball mounts, and we're just gonna hold ourselves upright like this. Sometimes we might move into a forward bend, but really for today, we're just gonna keep the spine lifting nice and tall. And then we'll switch to the other side. Once we're all done with this pose, we're gonna return to that Baddha Konasana pose, that bound angle pose. So I'm hooking underneath my knee near the thigh, almost swinging my ankle in. But if the knee is tense, go ahead and use your other hand and give that leg some support. And we'll be here back in Baddha Konasana. All right, let's go ahead and do it together. So having a strap nearby, if you have one, you can bring your knees up and one leg at a time, extending your heels out to the side. Try and have some reference so that you can Determine if your heels really are in line with each other, nice and symmetrical. And as you take a few breaths here, go ahead and place your hands on that pit of the thigh. So as you spread your thumb and your index finger, noticing that check mark or that L position, really placing that there at the pit of the thigh. Now it's not on the abdomen, it's not on the hips. Instead, you can even take your hands and kind of pull them up your thigh and really feel where that crease is. So it's the top of the femur bone, that top of the thigh. As you press that area down towards the floor, try to lift the chest up, taking a nice, smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. Notice if your low back or your sacrum is dropping to the wall behind you. This might be a sign that it's time to add some more support underneath the hips. With every inhale and every exhale, soften the face, soften the eyes. Now we're going to take our arms up and overhead. Feel that upward rising sensation in the spine as the arms go up and overhead. It might even be more apparent that your low back is dropping to the wall behind you or to the floor once the arms are up and overhead. So see if you can use that lift to really pull the hips up, pull the sacrum up. One more smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. And then we'll bring our hands down. Now we're going to practice something that I didn't demonstrate, but I hope that you can follow along with my words and maybe view as we do this. So we're going to lace the fingers together and we're going to turn the palms away from us as we straighten the arms. So again, I'm lacing the fingers together, turning the palms away from myself, and then we'll lift the arms up and overhead. This pose is called bound finger pose. But when you're seated, it's actually called little mountain pose. So this one has two names depending on the position of the rest of the body. So Parvatasana, little mountain pose, is you press your heels down, press your thighs down, and lift the chest up. You're going to notice it's a little bit easier to lift the spine when the feet are active here. You'll also notice that really actively pressing the thighs down to the floor is going to help give you a nice boost to lift up. And then you'll slowly bring your hands back down. Notice which pinky is on the loose end. And we're going to switch that lacing of the fingers. So this one might feel a little bit different. Turning the palms away and reaching the arms up and overhead. Now, if you're at this point really feeling some achiness in the hips or like this is really testing your hip mobility, make it easier for yourself and just go ahead and bring those feet a little bit closer to each other. They don't have to be as wide if your body's not feeling that that's very comfortable or if it's really distracting. So keep that in mind that that's always an option. You don't always have to go to the maximum of your practice. Taking a smooth, steady inhale and exhale, pressing the heels down, pressing the thighs down, and charging the chest up towards the ceiling. Notice if your shoulders are lifting towards your ears. And as you keep that lift of your chest, try and soften the shoulders away. So there is one level of softening the shoulders so that they drop away from the ears. But then there's also another layer of actively pulling those shoulders down your back. So see if you can actively pull your shoulders, shoulder blades down the spine so that there's a lot more space between the shoulders and the ears here. Very nice. Then you'll bring your hands down, unlace the fingers. You can just rest your hands on your thighs, taking a nice, smooth, steady inhale and exhale. So now we're going to move into our twisted version of this, Parshva Upavista Konasana. Parshva means side. So you're going to take your belt and you're going to place it across the toe ball mounds of your foot. So it's not necessarily on the arch today, not necessarily on the heel today, although those are things we might practice at times. Specifically, you want it to be on the toe ball mounds. And as the feet are flexed and you're holding on to the sides of the strap, take a nice deep exhale and turn your rib cage towards your straight leg. I didn't tell you which side to go to, so I'm twisting towards my left. You very well may be twisting towards your right. Whichever one it is, as you take a nice deep exhale, notice what that hip is doing that you're not turning towards. So sometimes that hip we're turning away from really likes to lift. It wants to come with us as we do the twist. But really see if you can sink that hip down. An action that can help you do this is thinking about that hula movement that we practiced while on the floor. We were shifting our hips from side to side. And so as you're twisting here towards one of your legs, think about that hula movement and see if you can actually drive that opposite sit bone down into the floor or your blanket stack specifically. As you press the heels down, press the thighs down, lift your chest up. Nice deep, steady inhale, deep, steady exhale. Now keep your lift as you turn back to center. So you still want to maintain that upward rising sensation in the spine, even as we come out of the twist. Then you can remove your strap, and we're going to move to the other side now. So taking the strap, placing it across the toe ball mounds on the opposite foot now. So you take a nice deep exhale, turning your rib cage towards that straight leg. You can have a slight bend in your elbows and even lift the elbows up slightly. Notice what's happening in that hip that you're twisting away from. You can use your hands if you felt that that was helpful and really help press it down to the floor. But overall, we want to figure out how to access some movement from the internal work. So rather than manipulating it from the outside in, see if you can manipulate your posture from the inside out. And so as you integrate that hula movement, really sinking that opposite hip down into the floor as you lift the chest, lift the entire spine up towards the ceiling. Nice, deep, smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. And then keeping that lift and that rising of the chest as you come back to center, and you can release the strap. Setting that strap off to the side, we're going to return to that bound angle pose that we were in before. And so you can bend your knees slightly. We're going to hook underneath the thigh near the knee. And if your knee is tense to any degree, use your other hand to support it, holding underneath that ankle and bringing it down to the floor while encouraging that external rotation. Some people can just swing their ankles in when holding underneath the thigh near the knee, but others might find it very, very helpful to relieve some pressure in the knee by supporting the ankle as you pull it in. Taking a nice, smooth, steady inhale and exhale while you're sitting here. Now you're welcome to stay in this position for a moment because I'm going to demonstrate what we're up to next. So this next pose or series of poses that we're going to practice is going to involve a chair or some blocks. If you have a chair, I highly recommend using it. It's a wonderful support. They make these fancy yoga chairs that don't have the backing or the rail on one of the sides. But I know that everyone might not have that. Even a dining room chair, or again, if those are just, it's not realistic for you in the setting that you're practicing in, some blocks will do just fine. So I'm going to demonstrate with both of those props and show you where we're headed next. I'm going to clear my mat off, and I'm going to have my chair or my blocks nearby. If you have blocks, you can place one on each side of the mat. And we're going to be working here facing the length of our mat, meaning that we want that longer side of the mat facing and spanned out in front of us. So we're going to start by coming into downward facing dog. Adho Mukha Svanasana is the pose. And then we're going to move into a low lunge. So I'm going to show you and demonstrate where we're headed before we practice this together. So I'm going to start with my hands slightly forward from my shoulders, knees slightly back from my hips. I'm gonna curl my toes under and lift my hips up. I want my feet to be about hip width apart here. I'm not too concerned about your heels getting to the floor. Instead, what I want you to think about in this position is lifting the hips up and feeding that length of the spine. You're welcome to take your hips down or your heels down to the floor, but notice if your back rounds when you do that. So you can look at my back here and my hips here. This is where my back is just rounded just so slightly. But if I can lift my heels and lift my hips, now I'm really lifting that sacrum in my back, which helps bring some more depth to my hips here. So that's the priority. Not concerned about your heels, really want to keep that form in your hips. Now, coming into the low lunge, we're going to come almost into this push-up style position, and I'm going to reach my foot forward and step it as far forward as I can. Now, this is where you can see where that chair is going to be helpful, or even having some blocks to kind of hold yourself up with. Either way, I have my back legs straight, toes are still curled under, and I'm taking a few deep breaths here. And then to come out of this, I want to move the blocks out of the way. So I have something solid supporting my hands. And then I'm going to bring that foot back and come back into that downward facing dog. And then we'll do the other side. Now I'll demonstrate with the chair. You'd have the chair close by, and you can even hold yourself up here. This makes it a lot more attainable. It's not so deep, not nearly as challenging as that version where you're pretty close to the floor. And then you have some variety here. You can even come down to your forearms. So the chair is wonderful. Now, if you don't have a chair, you feel like the blocks are not supporting you enough, then that's where having either the edge of your couch or even using the wall might be helpful for you today. And then we'll come back into that Adho Mukha Svanasana position. Once we're all done, we're going to take our knees wide, point the toes back, and the toes come together. And then we're going to sit down on our heels. As you take a few breaths here, moving into a downward facing child's pose. So that's where we're headed. If that did look like it was a lot for the hips, I just want to briefly show how you might use a wall. Instead, you would be practicing something like this, and then you can step that knee forward and practice in this sense. So it's a little bit of a shorter stance. Maybe you can even take that back leg away from you a little bit more, but you have a lot more support with the wall. So we have a lot of options here. And if you were to come out, you'd step the feet back and we do the other side. And then to come out of the pose, the legs would be together and you would just walk forward before taking your hands off the wall. So we have a lot of options, right? Say that one is definitely going to be the easiest one. Chair is going to be the second most accessible. Blocks to the floor is going to be a little bit of an added challenge. So you have a little taste of what we're practicing based on the poses we already went through. So you can decide what would be best for you. If you're at the wall, awesome. We're going to go ahead and get started though. So if you are on the floor, you're using a chair or some blocks. We'll start with the hands slightly forward from the shoulders, knees slightly back from the hips with the toes curled under. If you're at the wall, you'll just take your hands to about hip height on the wall and step your feet back so that they're a little bit farther than your hips, farther back behind you than your hips. Now, in downward facing dog, you'll curl the toes under and lift your hips up. Everybody lift your heels away from the floor and try and lift your hips up towards the ceiling. Think about your sit bone and your sit bones stretching upward. Now we have a different relationship to gravity here. And so it might take a little bit more effort to really tune into our spine and tune into our low back or our pelvis. But I want you to remember how it felt while you were laying on the floor. There might have been times where you felt your low back digging into the floor because the pelvis was rounded or the low back was rounded slightly. Now this can happen here. You might not have the floor to give you that feedback, but see if you can tune in to whether or not your low back is rounding here. As you lift your sit bones, lift your tailbone up towards the ceiling, You'll feel a little bit more of your sacrum, feel the back of the pelvis even lifting upward. So your hands press down or press into the wall, stretch your hips back, deepening that hip crease that we've been working with and becoming familiar with today. Now we're gonna move into that low lunge. So we'll take our right foot forward first. You'll come into that kind of push-up position, and then right foot, big step forward. Now you can grab your blocks, or you can move your chair in a little bit closer, whatever you feel is best for your practice today. If you're at the wall, you're just stepping your right foot forward. Whichever position that you're in, focus on making that back leg completely straight. Still, the toes are lifting off the floor on that bent knee. Now, this pose, I feel, out of a lot of them, has a pretty sensational experience on that pit of the thigh of that bent leg. And so think of that hula dancer, right? Sometimes that hip of the bent knee wants to lift up and that whole sideways is compressed or shrinking. But instead, see if you can sharpen your right sit bone and stretch it back to the wall behind you, deepening that hip crease. And then we'll come back into downward facing dog. So you can shift your blocks away, stepping that right foot back, and returning to that downward facing dog position. If your arms are feeling tired here, you're welcome to come down and rest just for a breath, but then come back up and join us. And we're gonna move to that left side, coming forward into that push-up position, reaching that left foot forward, almost as if you could try and get your left foot close to where your hand is in relationship to your chest. We want to see that our left knee, let me see if I can move, that our left knee is directly over the heel. So if your knee is beyond the foot, make some adjustments to get that left knee directly above the heel. If you haven't already, grabbing your blocks or your chair, getting that back leg completely straight. So you press your thigh up towards the ceiling, drive your heel away from you. I'm talking about that straight leg. Then on that left leg, the bent knee, try and lift your toes off the floor. Think about that hula dancer. Notice if that whole left side waist is really tight. And instead, see if you can sharpen and lift that left sit bone away from you as you charge your chest forward. Softening the eyes, softening the face. It's really just the body that's putting this effort in, not so much the face or the eyes. And you can set your blocks or chair aside and return to that downward facing dog position. As you lift your heels up, lift the hips up, and then try and keep your hips lifting as you slowly bring your heels down to the floor. Notice if your hips drop. Notice if your low back rounds. And if your heels don't make it all the way to the floor, that's absolutely fine. Let's prioritize getting that lift of the hips, lift of the sit bones. And now to come down and rest, you take the knees wide. You'll point your toes back so the tops of the feet are on the floor, and then sit back on the heels. Adho Mukha Virasana, downward facing child's pose. Just taking a smooth, steady inhale and exhale. You can let your arms rest on the floor. Now we're going to stay in this position for a moment. You're going to integrate a little more activity. So as you press your hands down, try and lift your elbows off the floor. As you lift your elbows and lift your shoulders Your whole armpit lifts away from the floor. Try to turn your inner arm up towards the ceiling, outer arm down towards the floor. Now we're rotating that upper arm bone. And as you turn your inner arms up, outer arms down, try and pull the shoulders down the spine. So creating that space between the shoulders and the ears. Now, I know that this webinar is about hips, but sometimes when we're in these postures and we're thinking so much about the hips, we might forget how the shoulders are affecting the neck, are affecting the upper back. Really creating some support in this area can just help keep some stability in the spine so that the hips have an option to become a little bit more mobile with that support. Elbows lifting, armpits lifting, turning the inner arms up, outer arms down, and you can let your head hang. And then we'll slowly press ourselves back up to sit. You're welcome to sit up nice and tall, or you can even push yourself up to stand. I want you guys to just watch for a moment while I demonstrate what we're up to next, and then we'll do it together. So this next pose that we're going to practice, or these next series of poses that we're going to practice actually, is also going to require a similar type of support that we just used. So you can use your chair or you can use your blocks. You can also use the wall. It's just going to be, we just have to have that length of the wall. We are going to take the feet wide. So I'll demonstrate where we're headed, and then you'll kind of have an idea of what you might need and what would be best for you to use. So I'm going to start with my blocks out in front of me. Then I'm going to step back, and I'm just demonstrating so that you kind of see where we're headed. So it's going to be a series of poses that we're going to go through next. I'm just starting standing at the back edge of my mat, and I'll step my feet wide. You're welcome to jump the feet wide, but usually we step for mindfulness in the ankles, knees, and hips, and we'll jump for lubrication of the joints or energy. So that's your choice. My feet are quite wide here. If I were to reach my hands out to the side, really almost want to try and get my ankles in line with my wrists. Then with the hands on the hips, I'm going to bend forward, bringing the hands to the floor or some type of support. We still want that nice flat back or concave spine as we practice this. So we'll take a few breaths here. We'll even walk our hands forward, getting some length while our hips are directly over the heels. Now from here, this is where it gets fun. I'm going to start by bending my left knee, and I'm going to pivot on my toe ball mount here. So I'm lifting my heel and I'm turning my knee out to the side. And I'm going to bring my block with me as I come into a pose called Utthita Parshva Konasana. And so now taking my hand out to the side, I'm going to reach my arm alongside my ear, creating a nice line from my outer foot of the straight leg all the way up to my fingertips. Now from here, we're going to lift ourselves up into Virabhadrasana 2. This is Warrior 2 pose. I still have that nice bend in my front knee as I go through this process here. And then we'll come back down, and then we'll straighten that leg for Utthita Trikonasana, or extended triangle pose. Then to come out, I'm going to bend my knee. I can bring my hand down in front of me. Block comes around in front of me, and I'm going to reset, lifting that heel up, pivoting on my toes, and now I'm back at that starting position here. You can adjust the blocks. We'll take a breath here before we go to the other side. So if you are using a wall, you might notice that you'll have to have your hands up and elevated a little bit, and then you're also going to want a prop that's kind of behind you and off to the side, so that when we move into positions like this, you're going to have some support behind you as well. So if you are using a wall, just keep that in mind. Okay, now to come out of this, we're going to keep the hands down once we've done each side, And we're gonna heel toe step the feet together, and we'll bring the feet all the way together, inner edges of the feet together, taking a breath here. And then we'll move the feet about hip width apart, cross the arms, and just allow the head to hang in this pose called Uttanasana, intense stretch pose. We're just letting the arms and the head hang. You can even just let the arms fall to the floor. And then hands on the hips, and we'll slowly come up to stand. So that's where we're headed. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going to try and give as much verbal detail as I can while we go through it so that you don't have to remember everything, but hopefully you'll be able to recall the demonstration as we start going through it. So you'll start with some support in front of you, standing in the very center of your mat. Bring your heels to the back edge, the long edge of your mat. Then you're welcome to bring the fingertips together, and you can jump or step the feet wide, whichever you're most comfortable with or your body is most comfortable with today. And as you reach the hands off to the side, see if you can bring your heels directly underneath your wrists. And as you take a breath here, and you can bring your hands to your hips. The toes are turned in slightly in this pose. You can make that adjustment now. And then observe that your heels are in line with each other, that they really are the same distance from that back edge of the mat. With your hands on your hips, really on that pit of the thigh, you're gonna bend forward, lengthening the spine so the chest is still charging forward as you bend down, and bring your hands to the blocks or the floor. Notice if your hips are leaning back beyond your heels, or notice if they're maybe leaning forward and weighing heavy on your toes, and instead see if you can get your hips directly over the heels. As you roll your shoulders onto your back, so you're lifting the shoulders away from the floor and then pulling the shoulders away from the ears. Arms are still straight. And then start to walk your hands forward. So very similar to that downward facing dog pose. So you press into your heels, lift your toes. Try to lift your hips just like we've worked on today, really deepening that pit of the thigh, and let the head hang. Smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. Then you're gonna bring your hands back in close to you. Now this is where it gets fun, right? We're making that transition now. So we're gonna start with the right leg. I know I demonstrated on my left, but as you lift your right heel, pivot on your right toes, and we're externally rotating that whole knee with the knee bent slightly, or that whole hip rather, with the knee bent slightly. And then we're gonna take some support around to the outer foot, outer thigh. You can see my arm is on the outside of the thigh there as I'm here in Parshva Konasana. So as you reach your arm up alongside the ear, feel that nice long line from the outer foot all the way to your fingertips. You'll even feel that pit of the thigh on that bent leg. Now, earlier in class, we kind of talked about trying to get this external rotation in the leg by using a muscular contraction as opposed to pressing on our legs with our hands. So as you lift your right toes off the floor, see if you can actually stretch your right knee back to the wall behind you. Really what we want to see is that that knee is directly over the heel. Often that knee likes to drop forward because the hip might be tight. So see if you can lift the toes up, lift that whole inner knee up as you take your knee back to the wall behind you here in Utthita Parshva Konasana. As you take an exhale, pull yourself up, keeping the form of the legs. So now the chest is over the hips. We're in Virabhadrasana too. And you better believe that that move of lifting yourself up does take a little bit of power. It does take a little bit of effort there. As you take a nice deep inhale and exhale, press that left thigh completely straight as you lift the chest up. Still lifting the right toes and drawing that right knee back. Very nice. And then we'll come back down, Parshva Konasana, and we're gonna straighten that bent leg. Utthita Trikonasana, extended triangle pose. Take a nice smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. Try and deepen that pit of the thigh that you're leaning over, and turn your rib cage towards the ceiling. If you feel comfortable doing so today, you can even take your gaze up to the ceiling. But if there's any tension in the neck or the spine to any level, by looking up to the ceiling, you'll just keep the gaze forward. And then to come out, we'll bring our hand down, bend the knee, and we're gonna bring our hands forward before pivoting on that toe ball mount again to take the heel, the original start position. You can adjust your feet if it's needed. The pose that we're kind of moving from is called Prasarada Padottanasana, extended intense stretch of the foot. Just taking a breath here, almost using this as a recoup. And we'll do the other side. So now lifting the left heel, pivoting on that toe ball mount. We're gonna take our block or chair with us to the outside of that leg. And as we bend that left knee, having the knee directly over the heel, and also trying to attempt to get your thigh parallel to the floor. Now this might be a little more difficult if you don't have enough support under your hands, or if the hips are a little bit tighter. So that's where that higher level of support is going to be helpful. Maybe having the block on the high setting, or again, getting a chair at some point might be a really great aid. So here we are in Utthita Parshva Konasana. You'll reach your arm along the side of the ear. As you press down into the outer right foot, lift the whole right sideways. A nice straight long line. Now on a deep exhale, pulling yourself up, Virabhadrasana 2. You lift your left toes off the floor, try and press that knee back muscularly. So we're not using our hand, we're just really using the intelligence of the leg. Then trying to make that right leg stick straight. Then we're gonna come back down. Now the arm is just reaching straight up to the ceiling as we straighten that bent knee for Utthita Trikonasana. Deepening that pit of the thigh that we're bending over as you turn your rib cage up towards the ceiling. If you feel comfortable doing so, you can take your gaze up to the ceiling as well. And then to come out, we'll bend that left knee, bring the hand down, bring our support forward before pivoting on our toes and putting our heels back in that start position. If you've noticed your legs shift from the practice, you can go ahead and realign them. And then we'll walk the hands forward and let the head hang. Just taking a smooth, steady inhale, smooth, steady exhale. With the head below the heart, it's a little bit more restfulness that starts to come across the body, across the mind. Now you'll bring your blocks back in so that your wrists are underneath the shoulders. Heel, toes, step the feet together. Now we're practicing that intense stretch pose. You'll start with the feet completely together. So inner heels, inner big toe ball mounds are touching. And give a little bend to your knees. Keeping the knees bent, try and lift your tailbone up towards the ceiling. And then as you start to straighten your legs slowly, take your chest down to the floor. So sit bones, tailbone is lifting as the chest lengthens, even drives towards the floor. You'll straighten the legs, letting the head hang. And then you'll take your heels apart, The toes will follow, and you're gonna heel toe step your feet to a little bit wider than hip width apart. So not as wide as we just were, but just a little bit wider than the hips. And then you'll cross your arms and let your head and your arms hang. Now for these next few breaths, you're welcome to just allow the spine to round. Focus on lengthening your inhale and exhale. As your legs do the work of lifting your hips up, just allow gravity to bring some length to your spine. And then you'll bring your hands down to the floor, lengthen the spine. So we're creating what they call a concave back here. So there's a little more attentiveness in the spine as you roll the shoulders back. Now you can take your time coming up to stand. We'll bring our hands to the hips and slowly lifting ourselves up. If you notice any dizziness or lightheadedness, you'll go ahead and just bend back forward or maybe take an extra breath on the way up. Wonderful. Well, that was a lot of fun and the most effort we're going to extend in this webinar today. But now we're going to move into some supine poses, so some reclined laying down poses. At a minimum, I'm going to recommend that you have 2 blankets for this next one. One of those blankets is going to be used for the head. And I'm going to demonstrate this prop setup and the pose and how we're going to get in and how we're going to come out. So you can just watch for a moment, but making sure that you have some props nearby is pretty important. So you're going to need 2 blankets. If you only have 1 blanket, let's say, you're going to want to prioritize the one that's underneath your hips. Or you can use some blocks to support the hips, but you're going to need something to support the hips. So I'll show some variations and some options on that. If you are minimal on blankets, that's where we'll integrate the blocks. So I'm going to have those out and I'll kind of show where you would substitute those in. Now you can go ahead and do this with me because this is a little bit about, prepping the props for the pose. When the blanket is folded in this position here, we call this shelf fold. And it might open like this, or if you have a different fold going on or a different blanket style going on, maybe it's a little bit different. But we want to unfold it one more time from there. And so you can see it's pretty long. It would be, almost the length of a towel, a short towel when it's open. And then we're going to roll the long edge of that blanket or that towel. And so you're going to get this long roll, kind of like this. And then your other support or blanket is going to be underneath the head. You can use a block for underneath the head as well if you're minimal on blankets. Or we can do what I'll show you here in a moment, which is support the hips. So now that we have our props set up, I'm going to demonstrate, and then after that we'll do together. We're going to start in that Baddha Konasana pose. Feet together, knees wide. This is bound angle pose. Now I'm going to take my rolled blanket and I'm going to set it on top of my feet, and then I'm going to sweep it, sweeping the end on the floor. I'm going to tuck it here under my hip socket. So it's really helping hold and support that thigh bone in the hip joint. I'm going to do the same for the other side. I'm sweeping that blanket around and kind of tucking it underneath my hips here. Now, as long as your knees are comfortable, you can really bring your heels in quite close to your pelvis. Now from here, I'm going to be mindful as I come down. I'm going to lean back on my hands, come down to the elbows, and then spread the elbows as I lie down on the floor. I can adjust the head support underneath me, and then even grab these ends of the blankets and pull them in. Maybe lift my hips up to tuck them more underneath me. And so here I am in Supta Baddha Konasana. Now I had mentioned, that you can support the hips. Let's say you don't have enough blankets. You'd want to have something that you could place really on the outside of that hip or to help support that femur bone. So we want the support to be even from left to right. So whatever you use on your left side, you'd want to use on your right side. But this is another variation. If you're short on blankets, you can also use some blocks. Again, you can use those blocks underneath the hips like this, or if you have a blanket down there, you can rest your head on the block, whatever is most comfortable for you. The most comfortable position, in my opinion, is using 2 blankets. So it's definitely worth having those things. Now to come out, we're just gonna bring the knees together and we're gonna straighten the legs for a few breaths. This pose is Shavasana, and the intention is to let go of everything, everywhere. Once we take a few breaths there with some quietness, we'll bend the knees, roll over to our side, and we'll come up to a comfortable seated posture. Say namaste to one another. So if you have any questions, again, please feel free to speak up, chime in. I'm sure that there are a handful of you that are quite familiar with this pose. And, you know, the more props you have, more luxurious it gets. So if you have a bolster, you can even place that underneath your spine and have it to lean back on, although it's not necessary. So you'll have your blanket all set up for your head. You have your rolled blanket. If you haven't gotten in already, then we'll go ahead and do it together now. So with the feet together and the knees wide, you'll grab your rolled blanket and place it on your feet. From here, you'll sweep the tail ends on the floor and then tuck them underneath your hips. Do this to both sides. Then you'll bring your hands behind you and slowly lower down to your elbows, and then spread the elbows away from you to lay down flat on the floor. Adjust the support underneath your head so the shoulders are free from support. It's really just your neck and your head that's resting on that blanket, and the shoulders are resting on the floor. And you can grab the tail ends of that rolled blanket that's around your legs and pull your feet in a little bit closer, as long as the knees are comfortable with this. And you can lift your hips up and tuck those tail ends of the blanket right underneath the hip socket. It's almost like it gives the hip a little massage, also helps support that hip joint. And just to start, go ahead and place your hands on your abdomen. You can have the eyes open or the eyes closed for this, whichever is most comfortable for you. And as you take a few deep breaths here, soften any tension in the abdomen, releasing any gripping in the eyes, lips, or jaw. With your hands on your abdomen, become attentive to your breath. Feeling your inhale and exhale move through the body. And you'll rest your hands on the floor. Have the wrists far enough away from your hips so you feel that the armpits are open, that the sides of the rib cage are open and can breathe. And as you exhale, notice your body settling into the floor. You're welcome to stay in this pose for Shavasana if you prefer it. Otherwise, you'll start to bring your knees together and just straighten the legs. I'm just laying flat on the floor with the feet a little bit wider than the hips. As you exhale, let go of everything, everywhere. Slowly place your hands on your abdomen. Take a moment to appreciate your body for all that it's done and all that it will do. Appreciate your mind for taking the time to practice, focus, and harmonize with your body today. You'll take your time coming up. We'll start by bending the knees, bringing the knees together, and reaching your arm up and overhead, rolling to your side, and pressing yourself up to a comfortable seated posture. Feel free to grab any props or support that will help you sit comfortably. As you bring the hands together in the center of the chest in Namaskar. Take a nice deep inhale and exhale. I appreciate you all for taking the time to practice yoga with me today. Namaste. So if you have to go and you have some other things to attend to, awesome. If you do have an extra moment, we didn't get a chance to practice a seated twist, and I'd like to take some time to actually do that now before we move into a little bit of a Q&A, just in case there's any questions that we need to address. So for the seated twist, we are going to start with our legs crossed, sitting nice and tall. Then we're going to twist off to the left. And so as you take a nice deep exhale, turning the rib cage, bringing the left hand behind you, right hand across. Even though that right hand might be touching the thigh, try to not to pull that leg up, but instead press it down to the floor. Twist where you feel you need to twist. And as you gently lengthen your inhale and exhale, allow that movement of the breath to tune you into your body. And then we'll come back to center, twisting off to the right. Taking a nice deep inhale and exhale. Twisting where you feel you need it most. And we'll come back to center. Notice which leg is closest to you. We're gonna switch the cross of the legs. Do each side one more time. Twisting off to the left. If you feel comfortable doing so, you can even lift your chin, looking over that right shoulder. And coming back to center. Last side, last time, twisting off to the right. And then coming back to center. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. We covered a lot of stuff, and I really, really hope that you found at least one or maybe even two poses that you can enjoy daily or integrate into a daily practice. And if you ever have any questions, please always feel free to reach out to me.